There are a number of developing countries who really have increased their allocation to education, especially over the last 10 years, and are really at the forefront in the world of supplying quite a bit of resources to education. And that isn't even sufficient, frankly, for reaching all their kids.
This is At Brookings, a weekly, in-depth look at issues behind the news. This week, education in developing countries, a global priority.
There's a learning crisis in developing countries where children are either poorly educated or denied an education altogether. Some countries invest more in their armed forces than they do in their classrooms, even though additional schooling can lead to higher incomes, benefiting the child and the overall economy. Education is a fundamental human right and is the best tool for tackling poverty and other issues, notes Senior Fellow Rebecca Winthrop. Rebecca, you write that there is a learning crisis that is affecting the developing world, and this crisis, you say, has three distinct dimensions.
If we look at what are the actual problems of the learning crisis, and this is really across the developing world, a lot of kids are getting into school, but there is still a problem of a number of very marginalized groups who are not. And so there's groups who are still not getting learning opportunities or opportunities to learn. And these, by and large, are kids who live in conflict countries. Half of the kids who are out of school in the world today live in countries affected by armed conflict and war and violence. And these are kids who are rural, who are very poor, and oftentimes are girls.
All right, so while many children are in school, the education they're getting is subpar, and you say this is especially evident in their reading skills.
Hundreds of millions of kids in school in the developing world today. Estimates are that there's about 200 million children who are really struggling to even learn the most foundational skill, which is to read. For example, there's incredible data, shocking data, showing that, for example, in Uganda, the African country of Uganda, kids who are at grade 7, so they've finished primary school, they're in, lower secondary school, can barely read at a grade 2 level. Almost a quarter of kids in Uganda at grade 7 can barely read at a grade 2 level. This goes around the continent of Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So kids are not learning foundational skills.
And then the third dimension is that many of these children are not getting educations that will prepare them for the jobs of today and tomorrow.
The third dimension of the learning crisis is really for those kids who actually end up being able to master foundational skills, progress on to higher education such as secondary school. They are not learning the relevant skills they need for their own lives and also for jobs and job opportunities. They're being trained in what really is an old way of doing education that was more suited to a colonial era that trains government bureaucrats, a few of them. And in fact, that's not where the job growth is. The job growth is in private sector enterprise, and you need critical thinking, teamwork, all sorts of transferable skills that they're not acquiring.
And what about educating girls in the developing world? Is there a barrier to this in some countries?
There's very high demand for education. It's just that there's a range of pressures on the family, and girls get the last straw. So, for example, if families who are very, very poor, one coping mechanism that they have is to marry their girls off. That gives them a little bit of resources, it frees up some burdens. That's a strategy that many families who are desperately poor choose. And it's frankly less for lack of interest, I think, oftentimes, of families to offer all their children an education, and more just a range of coping mechanisms that leave girls at the bottom.
And in the face of these findings, there's still a great number of countries that spend more on their military than they do on their classrooms.
Developing countries face a huge number of challenges, one of which you may expect and we hear a lot about, which is resources. There are some developing countries who don't spend nearly enough on education as they should, who spend a great deal more on other things like the military and security and a range of other sectors. And there's no hard and fast rule, But we do see that if a country puts around 4% of its GDP towards education, that those are the countries that are quite successful. And so that's an important target.
And what about conflict countries where wars can rage for decades?
Nowhere else is it so imperative that the next generation, who's going to be the future leaders of these countries, gets a really solid base in good literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, and life and labor skills. Because that really is the long-term sustainable path out of poverty and destitution for these countries, which certainly exacerbates the political conflicts that go on.
So what's the benefit here for the U.S.? How does educating children in the developing world directly impact the USA?
There's lots of good evidence to show that folks in the developing world, the more educated those populations are, the greater demand they have for American, for example, if you want to use the US as an example, American goods and services, more people buy iPods around the world, et cetera, et cetera. So it actually is directly helpful for our own economy. It's also very helpful to try to tackle some of the global challenges that we need everybody in the world to tackle. And that includes preventing diseases that flow across borders. That includes protecting our environment, which knows no sort of artificial borders that we have on our maps. It also includes things like security. Things like violent extremism have been shown to, be harder to take root in countries where there's a great deal of opportunity, education being one of those opportunities.
So what's the best course of action for addressing this learning crisis?
What countries need to do is take this idea of learning as the end goal rather than access as the end goal, which a lot of countries have been doing, seriously, and change the way they use their resources and invest in early childhood, in gaining sort of foundational literacy and numeracy skills and transitioning to relevant secondary education with relevant curriculum. Those things, just with existing resources, would make a big difference.
Stay up to date with the latest research, learn about Brookings events, and search our directory of experts, all from your mobile device. To download Brookings for your BlackBerry, Android, iPhone, or iPad, go to brookings.edu/mobile.
In this video, we'll be looking at the Berlin crisis of 1961. As you know, hopefully, after World War II finished, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation. We'll look a closer look there. The British zone is the green, the French zone is the blue, the American zone is the orange, and the Russian-controlled zone is in red. But notice that Berlin is right in the middle of the eastern part of Germany. Let's have a look at a closer map, a more detailed map of Berlin, which is there. And you can also see that it was divided into 4 zones. Again, blue for French, green for British, orange for American, and red for the Russian-controlled sections of Berlin. The British and American zones often worked together, and that was known as bizonia. Frequently, the French zone cooperated as well, all 3 Western allies working together, which was known as trizonia. In 1949, the zones sort of came to an end, and Germany formed into West Germany, the previous bits that were controlled by the Western allies, and East Germany, ironically called the German Democratic Republic. But again, notice that Berlin, as a free city, or the western half of Berlin as a free city, was right in the middle of East Germany. Remember that the Allies, the Russians and the Americans, didn't fully withdraw. There we see some American army soldiers at a very, very famous checkpoint called Checkpoint Charlie. If we just scroll along here, there are some American soldiers in the top picture patrolling the streets of Berlin. And here some Russian soldiers in their tanks in the eastern part of Berlin. Until 1961, Berliners could cross from east to west fairly easily using checkpoints like that. Because of this, a number of East Berliners crossed from East Berlin into West Berlin. Between 1949 and 1961, 2.7 million East Germans did this. Now, this was very embarrassing for East Germany and for the Soviet Union, because it showed that life in the West was superior to life in the communist East. We can have a quick look in this photograph here of East Berliners getting on board a British plane to leave for West Berlin, and from there they could travel to West Germany and the rest of Western Europe. This annoyed Khrushchev, and in 1958 he issued an ultimatum to President Eisenhower of the USA, demanding that Western forces leave West Berlin within 6 months.